You think you knew Spider-Man, the animated series? Nah, fam. We all remember it as that epic 90s cartoon with the killer theme song and amazing storylines, right? Just Peter Parker swinging around New York, fighting bad guys, learning responsibility. But what if I told you this show was actually a blueprint for psychological manipulation disguised as superhero entertainment? I'm talking about hidden messages, industry conspiracies, and programming techniques that shaped an entire generation. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you could ever imagine, and by the end of this, you'll realize your childhood hero was part of something way more sinister. The mind control through animation techniques. All right, let's start with something that'll absolutely wreck your brain. The animation style in Spider-Man. The animated series wasn't just artistic choice. It was psychological programming designed to create specific emotional responses in developing minds. We're talking about a show that used advanced color psychology and visual manipulation techniques that wouldn't become mainstream knowledge until decades later. Notice how Spider-Man's costume uses the exact color combination that triggers maximum attention and emotional attachment in children. Red and blue aren't just patriotic colors, they're scientifically proven to create feelings of trust and excitement simultaneously. The animators knew that kids would form deep psychological bonds with a character dressed in these specific shades, making them more susceptible to the messages embedded in the storylines. But here's where it gets darker than you could imagine. The web-swinging sequences were designed using hypnotic animation patterns that induce a trance-like state in viewers. Watch how the camera follows Spider-Man's movement in perfectly calculated arcs that match the natural rhythm of human brainwaves. This wasn't accidental, fam. Animation studios were working with child psychologists to create content that could bypass critical thinking and implant ideas directly into subconscious minds. The villain designs are even more sinister when you understand what they represent. Each major villain was created to embody specific fears and anxieties that would later be exploited by media and advertising industries. But that's nothing compared to the corporate conspiracy behind who was really controlling this show's message. The Marvel-Disney propaganda machine. So you think Marvel was just making cool superhero cartoons in the 90s? Think again, because the corporate manipulation behind Spider-Man, the animated series goes way deeper than you could ever imagine, and the connections to psychological warfare will make your skin crawl. Marvel wasn't operating independently when they created this show. They had direct partnerships with government agencies and corporate think tanks that were studying how to influence public opinion through children's entertainment. We're talking about a systematic effort to use beloved characters as vehicles for social programming. And Spider-Man was the perfect test subject because of his relatability and moral authority. But here's where it gets twisted beyond belief. The show's writers weren't just comic book fans, they included former military psychological operations, specialists, and advertising executives who understood exactly how to manipulate young minds. The storylines weren't just entertaining adventures. They were carefully crafted propaganda designed to instill specific values and beliefs that would serve corporate and government interests. Look at how the show portrays authority figures. Police are always incompetent or corrupt, teachers are clueless, parents are absent or useless, but corporations and scientific institutions are presented as the real sources of power and knowledge. This wasn't accidental storytelling, it was systematic conditioning to make kids distrust traditional authority while accepting corporate control as natural and inevitable. The timing of certain episodes coincided perfectly with real-world political events and social movements. Episodes about genetic experimentation aired during debates about biotechnology regulation. Stories about surveillance and privacy appeared just as governments were expanding digital monitoring capabilities. This wasn't coincidence, it was coordinated messaging designed to shape public opinion on policy issues through children's entertainment. The most sinister aspect is how the show programmed kids to accept that normal people can't solve problems, that only special individuals with extraordinary abilities can make real change. This created a generation of people who would rather wait for heroes to save them than take collective action themselves, which is exactly what corporate and government power structures want. But what they hid in the actual character development will blow your mind completely. Peter Parker, the perfect psychological profile. Buckle up, because what I'm about to tell you about Peter Parker's character design will completely destroy how you see not just Spider-Man, but how media creates psychological templates that shape entire generations of young people. Peter Parker wasn't just a relatable teenage character, he was a carefully constructed psychological profile designed to create the ideal consumer and citizen for the emerging digital age. Every aspect of his personality, his struggles, his relationships was engineered to model specific behaviors and attitudes that corporations and governments wanted to normalize in young people. Look at Peter's core characteristics. He's isolated, anxious, constantly guilty, obsessed with responsibility, and desperately seeking approval from authority figures. That's not a relatable everyman. That's a perfect psychological profile for someone who will work endless hours, consume products to manage anxiety, and never question systemic problems because they're too busy blaming themselves for everything that goes wrong. The great power, great responsibility message isn't inspiring. It's psychological manipulation designed to create a generation of people who would take personal responsibility for systemic failures. Can't find a job? It's your responsibility to work harder. Can't afford health care? You need to take more responsibility for your health. Society falling apart? Individual citizens need to be more responsible. This messaging shifted blame away from institutions and corporations and placed it entirely on individuals. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. Peter's secret identity storyline was programming kids to accept living double lives, hiding their true thoughts and feelings, and presenting false personas to the world. This was preparing children for a future where authentic self-expression would be dangerous, where success would require constant performance and self-censorship. The bullying storylines weren't anti-bullying messages. They were instructions for how to internalize abuse and redirect anger towards socially acceptable targets. Flash Thompson's character taught kids that bullies eventually become allies if you just endure the abuse long enough, which is exactly the kind of thinking that creates compliant workers and passive citizens. Most disturbing of all, Peter's transformation into Spider-Man represents the ultimate fantasy of powerlessness. He gains incredible abilities, but becomes more trapped and burdened than ever before. The show was teaching kids that power comes with such overwhelming responsibility that it's actually a form of slavery. The symbiote saga, addiction programming. All right, this is where things get absolutely terrifying, because the Venom symbiote storyline wasn't just cool alien costume drama, it was sophisticated programming about addiction, dependency, and psychological control that perfectly predicted how social media and digital technology would be used to manipulate human behavior. The symbiote attaches to Peter and initially makes him feel more confident, stronger, and more capable of handling his problems, but gradually it begins controlling his thoughts, making him more aggressive, and creating dependency where he can't function without it. Sound familiar? That's literally how social media platforms, gaming apps, and digital technology are designed to work. They provide initial benefits and enhanced capabilities, then gradually take control of your behavior and create addiction patterns. But here's where it gets darker than you could imagine. The symbiote doesn't just change Peter's behavior, it changes his personality and values. He becomes more selfish, more violent, and less empathetic while believing he's actually becoming a better version of himself. That's exactly how algorithmic manipulation works on social media. People think they're becoming more informed and connected, but they're actually becoming more isolated, more angry, and more susceptible to extremist thinking. The visual representation of the symbiote is pure psychological programming. It's black, it's liquid, it moves independently, and it literally covers and consumes its host. This was preparing kids to accept the idea that invisible forces could take control of their minds and bodies, and that this process would feel good initially before becoming destructive. Watch how other characters react to symbiote Peter. They can sense that something is wrong, but they can't identify exactly what it is. Peter himself doesn't realize he's being controlled until the symbiote's influence becomes so extreme that it threatens everything he cares about. This was programming kids to accept that mind control is subtle, gradual, and that victims often don't recognize what's happening to them. Most sinister of all, the symbiote doesn't disappear after being removed from Peter. It finds new hosts and continues spreading its influence. This was predicting how digital manipulation and social engineering would become systemic problems that affect entire populations, not just individual victims. The multiverse, reality fragmentation programming. Here's the revelation that's going to completely blow your mind and change how you see not just Spider-Man, but the entire concept of reality itself. The multiverse storylines in Spider-Man, the animated series, weren't just creative science fiction. They were psychological preparation for the fragmented post-truth reality we're living in today. The show introduced the concept that multiple versions of reality exist simultaneously, that truth is relative depending on which universe you're experiencing, and that individual perception determines what's real. This wasn't entertaining fantasy, it was programming kids to accept that objective reality doesn't exist, which is exactly the foundation of the post-truth information warfare we're experiencing today. Watch how different versions of Spider-Man from different universes have completely different moral codes, different relationships, different outcomes to the same situations. The show was teaching kids that there's no universal right or wrong, that morality is just a matter of perspective, and that conflicting truths can exist simultaneously without contradiction. This was preparing an entire generation for a world where facts would become negotiable and reality would be determined by whoever controls the narrative. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. The multiverse concept was specifically designed to fragment individual identity and create psychological dissociation. By showing kids that infinite versions of themselves exist making different choices, the show was undermining the concept of personal responsibility and authentic self-identity. Why commit to being one person when infinite alternatives exist? Most terrifying of all, the multiverse storylines normalize the idea that reality can be rewritten, that history can be changed, and that nothing is permanent or reliable. This was psychological preparation for living in a world where truth would be constantly manipulated by those in power, where historical facts would be revised to serve political purposes, and where individual memory and experience would be less reliable than institutional narratives. The show was literally programming kids to accept that they're living in a simulation where reality can be altered at will by unseen forces, which is exactly the kind of thinking that makes people susceptible to conspiracy theories, political manipulation, and social control. We weren't just watching Spider-Man save New York. We were being programmed to accept that reality itself is unstable and that truth is whatever those in power say it is. So there you have it, fam. One 90s cartoon was actually sophisticated psychological programming disguised as superhero entertainment. What other childhood favorites were secretly programming your mind? If this completely destroyed your childhood memories, smash that subscribe button for more mind-blowing revelations.